Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing Brave Dan by Osamu Tezuka, which is one of the titles I helped to kickstart in the Clockwork Apple campaign. Basically, this had already had a digital release, but due to, the stretch goals and, the funds, they were able to not only release it in a print edition, but they were also able to retranslate it. From what I've heard, the original digital release wasn't that great in terms of, grammar, punctuation, etc, etc. It just wasn't a very clean translation, so they were able to touch it up for this release. Without further ado, let's get on to the story. So, what is Brave Dan about? Well, it opens up in a forest. Basically, a man called Gen is being used for forced labor, and his boss, gets into a fight with him. He ends up killing his boss, and he and his family have to flee. When they're going through the forest, Gen actually sets the forest alight in order to be able to keep their pursuers away. Now, at the same time, there is a train bringing a tiger to a zoo. A flaming log lands on the track, and the train crashes into it, freeing the tiger. But as the tiger is fleeing through the forest, another tree falls down and traps the tiger. The family comes across it, and the child, Kotan, asks his father to help free the tiger. Again, reluctantly, frees the tiger, and they're caught, or at least they're somewhat trapped by their pursuers. And in the end, Kotan ends up in the care of this tiger, who we find out his name is Don. This is where, the story begins, and overall, I want to say that Brave Dan it's an entertaining work, but surprisingly, considering how much I love Osamu Tezuka, I found it rather forgettable. There's several things I need to point out about the story. So first of all, let's start out with what type of story is it. It's an adventure story. They find out about this mysterious Ainu treasure, which I'll explain what an Ainu is in a moment. And they have to be able to get it before this, evil organization gets their hands on it. It's a story that we've seen many, many times before, but, it's a decent little kind of adventure story. But one of the biggest disappointments I had in this series was the Ainu. Now, you might be asking, what is an Ainu? An Ainu is an ethnic group in Japan and also in Russia. And basically they lived in Hokkaido. Actually, a lot of them still do live in Hokkaido, as well as the islands around Hokkaido. And basically they had an ethnic identity separate from the Japanese, in terms of religion, in terms of culture, in terms of language, etc, etc. And I was hoping that I'd be able to find out more about the Ainu through this work, more about their history, more about their culture, etc, etc. But in the end, Osamu Tezuka treats the Ainu in the same vein as many authors have of, the ancient Egyptians or the Mayans or the Aztecs or something. Essentially a lost, almost extinct culture that, has a bunch of ruins and mysterious treasures, and, the characters must be able to find those treasures. So from that perspective, I did find that aspect a bit disappointing. Now, that's not to criticize the whole story, because, as I said, it is an entertaining story, albeit not particularly original, with lots of, interesting action sequences, in particular to do with Don, the tiger, and a lot of pretty nice humor. As usual, Osamu Tezuka has his, I almost said patented, not really, has his gags throughout the story, and there's a good few that made me chuckle. But overall, the story itself is quite forgettable. Now, in terms of characters, there's 3 characters I want to deal with. So let's start out with Don. He's the titular character. So what is Don? Don is, a decent character. He hates humans in general, but he's developed an attachment to Kotan. And so he wants to be able to defend Kotan, but at the same time, there's of course that issue of that he must return Kotan to the humans someday. Kotan can't spend his entire life living with a tiger. So there's that kind of struggle going on throughout the story, which is kind of nice. It's a little interesting perspective on the character himself. Something that did kind of surprise me, and I wish Osamu Tezuka had handled differently, is the fact that Don talks throughout the story. Now, what I mean by that is apparently he's speaking tiger, and Kotan is able to speak tiger back. Because later in the story there's a bit where Kotan is separated from Dan, and he returns to Dan, and he actually has a bit of trouble understanding him, and they say, oh, you spent too long with the humans, you've forgotten how to be able to speak to me. So clearly he's not speaking English or Japanese. But even so, I would have liked to see an interaction between Kotan and Dan if Dan didn't speak. Although I guess one risk of that is that it would go into that vein of Kotan repeating what Dan said in order that we recognize, what's happening. I think it would have been very interesting if Dan didn't speak. What can you do? In terms of Kotan, Kotan is a decent character. He's not particularly original either. He's, that kind of, I want to protect all the animals. I want to be able to defeat this organization before they can, commit horrible acts of evil, etc., etc. But one thing that is kind of interesting about it is that he is great friends with Dan. He's grown up with Dan for a long, long time. And when he interacts with humans, understandably, humans are scared of Dan. So Kotan has a bit of a kind of a struggle between whether he should return to the humans or he should stay with Dan. And that gives him a more interesting aspect than there would be otherwise. There's another character, Kosetsu Kaku, I think is the name. I can't remember too specifically. He's Chinese, which is why the name doesn't sound particularly Japanese. And he himself is a decent character. Probably, I would have to say, one of the more interesting characters throughout the story. He is a villain. In fact, he's kind of the face of the villainous organization. But he also has a bit of honor. There's a few aspects throughout the story where he interacts with Kotan, and he develops a respect of Kotan, to the point where there are several instances where he could kill Kotan dishonorably, but he chooses to forgo that in order that he might be able to have a face-off against Kotan at a later point. There is some sloppy work in regards to him as a character. Like, there's a little bit where we find out about his background, but it comes out so randomly. Like, it's like I was not expecting him to suddenly give his entire life story at that moment. So to me, that feels like a bit of a sloppy exposition sequence. But admittedly, as a kind of a character, he changes the most throughout the story, I have to say. Just in his interactions with the main characters of Dan and Kotan. So overall, he was quite an interesting character. One thing I would like to point out, though, about Kosetsu Kaku is that he's not exactly flattering in terms of the way he's drawn. He's Chinese, but he has that really, like, stereotypical Chinese look, really, like, squinty eyes. And to me, that just comes off as a bit, I don't want to say racist, because it certainly wasn't Osamu Tezuka's intention to do so. But, there isn't a huge difference in looks between the Japanese and the Chinese in real life. My point is the Japanese characters look like standard Tezuka characters, whereas the Chinese character looks like a bit of an Asian stereotype. I just have to point that out. I didn't find that too flattering. But overall, Kosetsu Kaku is probably the best character in this manga. So overall, in terms of story and characters, it's a decent little adventure romp, with decent action sequences, decent characters, decent comedy sequences. But I think you're starting to get a pattern here. It's decent. And I think that's the key point of this manga, that amongst, the pantheon of Tezuka catalog, it's very forgettable. And like, even there are manga that I've read from Osamu Tezuka that I've disliked more than this. Like, for example, Atom Cat, for example, Dororo. But even they have more of an identity than Brave Dan does. It's an entertaining little flick, but one that you'll probably forget relatively quickly. Now, this was drawn in 1962. And as can be expected, it has that 1962 Tezuka art style. What I mean by that is it's very cartoony. This is before he started implementing Gekiga style into his works. Now, that's not to say that it isn't pleasant. It is, actually. And surprisingly, for one of his cartoony works, there's actually a lot of, very large panel sequences, a lot of dynamic paneling. Not necessarily in that case, but there is actually a decent amount of examples throughout it. And charming character design. So, for one of his earlier cartoony looking works, it's pretty good looking manga. Actually, here's a perfect example of the stereotypical Chinese look that I was talking about. Is that guy over there, this chap here. As you can see, not exactly flattering. But overall, I would say the artwork is actually pretty nice. This is definitely one of the better looking cartoony, like earlier Tezuka works that I've seen. Now, in terms of digital manga's presentation of this work, first of all, as usual, it's in the exact same trim size as all of the other Osamu Tezuka works. For those of you who haven't seen the other Osamu Tezuka reviews, let me compare it to a standard tankobon. So, as usual, I have my trusty Yotsuba, and as you can see, it is this much bigger than Yotsuba. So as you can see, a little taller, slightly wider. It gives the art a little bit of room to breathe. Now, beyond that, the actual paper quality is nice. Digital Manga have upgraded the quality of the paper they've been using recently in their Kickstarter titles, which is very nice. It has a very pleasant look to the, to white levels. As usual, with a lot of the more recent Osamu Tezuka titles, it has an afterword by Osamu Tezuka, which is just simply kind of explaining, like why he did that story, what was the, kind of situation in his life when he drew that story. And also, we have a little section here. I won't show it to you because it's right beside the final page, which is, of course, a big spoiler. But it just simply says where it was serialized, Weekly Shonen Sunday, and from when? July 15th, 1962 to 23rd of December. So I think that's really nice little information to get. The translation is also pretty nice. I think there may have been, like, I don't know, 1 or 2 errors, but certainly not enough to impact my enjoyment of the story. The translation works very well. It's a significant improvement over the criticisms that people have had of the original translation, the digital one. Now, the one criticism I really want to point out about this, it's something that I've noticed actually in a lot of the recent releases of digital manga's Kickstarter titles, in terms of like Clockwork Apple, of Crime and Punishment, etc., etc. For some reason, they've removed page numbers. So, despite the fact that we have a little kind of a table of contents at the front, just saying, like the chapters and the page numbers as is standard, it really isn't that helpful because of the fact that there is no page numbers at all throughout this entire work, which is surprising. You wouldn't think it would be too much effort on their part to be able to include page numbers just for convenience sake. But for some reason they've removed that, and it seems to be a pattern with a lot of their recent releases, so I would like to know what the story is behind that. I'm sure there is a reason. They used to do that with the other titles, and it's not like they're, removing the quality of the work. As I said, the quality of like the translations of the actual paper quality, etc., etc., has gone up. So I just find that somewhat surprising. Finally, I guess the important thing to point out is, as usual with these digital manga Kickstarter titles, is the availability. So, as usual, Brave Dan isn't available on like Book Depository or Amazon. It is released physically exclusively through Akadot, which a lot of people will find annoying, But one thing that has been done recently, which will be a bit convenient to people, it used to be exclusive digitally on eManga, but recently, Digital Manga have decided to release a variety of Tezuka titles on Comixology. So you can actually pick up Brave Dan on that. The only thing I don't know is whether or not it uses the original translation, as in the first translation that was in the digital form, or the translation that was done for the print release. But I do want to point out it is available in that format. In terms of actual availability in print, you're going to have to either add it on in future Kickstarters or purchase it from Akadot. I know it's annoying, but that's what happens. So, overall, Brave Dan. What do I think of it? It's a, enjoyable work, but particularly among Tezuka titles, it's very forgettable. And if I had to make a comparison, this kind of feels a bit like Sandland to me, in that it's entertaining but highly forgettable. It's kind of the epitome of disposable manga, in that you can read it, you can enjoy it, but a week later, 2 weeks later, you'll probably have forgotten it. The only reason this has any significance at all is the fact that it's an Osamu Tezuka work. So, yeah, my opinion, if you're into Osamu Tezuka, if you want to, pick up more stuff from him, this is another work to add to your collection. But if you're starting out with Osamu Tezuka, this is certainly not what you'd want to start out with. There are a variety of other Osamu Tezuka titles that are, better written, that are more original, that have their own identity, that are more important and more entertaining, and make more of an impact on you. So overall, Brave Dan, it's good, but it's quite forgettable. And that's my opinion on Brave Dan. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.